Now, after more than 10 weeks of strict quarantine measures, the city has lifted lockdown restrictions. People will be allowed to leave the province as train, road and rail connections with the rest of the country are re-established. The move comes as Chinese authorities reported no new deaths from the virus for the first time since the outbreak began. Isaac is an American teacher who lives and works in Wuhan, and he welcomed the news.
I'm feeling good. I hope everything is going to clear up finally and I'll be able to go outside and finally have some freedom. I think I'm going to walk out my campus finally. I'm going to walk around and see what's open, what I can access. So it'll be a good thing after 77 days of quarantine.
China media analyst Kerry Allen spoke to the BBC's Nuala McGovern.
Looking on Sina Weibo, which is what Chinese people use instead of Facebook or Twitter, to see how people were reacting at the stroke of midnight. And one image just dominates everything. There's a full moon in China that everybody can see tonight. And what people are doing is they're going out of their window and they're posting a picture of the moon to show that they're all together again. And just this is such a beautiful act that I literally had to go and make a cup of tea and kind of compose myself.
Yeah, but you know, but what about that I was reading, that people are flocking to the train stations for outbound travel?
Yeah, this was one of the things I was seeing, that the high-speed trains were going to be running again, because this was when lockdown started. One of the first things that happened, outbound trains were just completely banned. And I remember seeing back in January, there was footage of people arriving at train stations and they had no idea that they couldn't leave the city on holiday. So they didn't live in Wuhan and they were basically stuck in the city. So yeah, this was one of the key moments really, that people could travel out again, but also other people could travel in.
It's not going to be everything lifted, you know, it's not full freedom. There are going to be some restrictions in place, I suppose, until they figure out exactly where or what this virus might be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, scanning of a green code is something that people are going to get used to now, that when they go on public transport or they go in stores, they scan a code on their phone which tracks their movements. But also one of the other things that is particularly causing trouble, I mean, even not just in Hubei province, but in wider China, is there are still a number of students who aren't able to go back to school yet, particularly primary schools. A lot of children are still indoors, so they're having to do online learning. And one of the things that I've been seeing is there's a vlogger based in Wuhan called Lei Jing. He's got about 1 million followers, and he's been able to go out a day early and to see what Wuhan's like. And he's been going to a big mall with his girlfriend, and every store they were going into, they were having their temperature checked. But also there was hand sanitizer everywhere, so people were getting used to, well, they were getting an idea of what a new normal might look like.
China media analyst Kerry Allen. The acting secretary of the US Navy has resigned amid uproar over his handling of a coronavirus outbreak on an aircraft carrier. Thomas Modley fired the vessel's captain, Brett Crozier, after he pleaded for help in a letter which was leaked to the media. Mr Modley later apologised. After it emerged, he'd called Captain Crozier's actions naive and stupid. His exit comes a day after President Trump suggested he might get involved in the dispute. Here's our correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue.
This is all centred around an outbreak of the virus on the Theodore Roosevelt, which is now sort of docked in Guam in the Pacific, and there was the commander of that vessel had to leave his post, and there was some comments that were made public by the acting secretary of the Navy. Anyway, there's been a lot of upheaval at the Pentagon, and this is just another episode of someone having to leave their post at a very senior level in the Pentagon. It's not a happy place.
Gary O'Donoghue. The head of the group of Eurozone finance ministers has called for bold measures in response to the coronavirus crisis. Ahead of a meeting of EU finance ministers, Mario Centeno said ministers had to show their citizens they'd be protected. He's urging them to approve an economic recovery plan, as Danny Eberhard reports.
The figures are mind-boggling. More than €500 billion. European Union finance ministers are trying to thrash out an emergency package described by Mario Centeno, Portugal's finance minister, as arguably the most ambitious ever. It would aim to ensure countries and businesses can access sufficient credit to ensure the EU doesn't get mired in a long-term recession. All of this is on top of national measures already announced. The package would see member states contribute billions of dollars to leverage much greater sums from the markets. Expect wrangles too over other schemes to raise yet more funds, such as a French-backed plan to issue joint bonds. Countries including Germany and the Netherlands oppose such ideas, fearing their taxpayers may get saddled with liabilities from others' debts.
Danny Eberhard. The meeting comes as France recorded a steep rise in its daily number of coronavirus-related deaths. The country registered 1,417 deaths on Tuesday, its worst figure to date. And elsewhere, doctors in Italy, the second worst affected country after China, have criticised officials for the lack of protective equipment given to health workers and the extent of testing. As dozens of countries around the world remain in lockdown, the International Labour Organization says the coronavirus pandemic is threatening the livelihoods of 1.25 billion workers. It said more than 80% of workers in the world have been affected. Our correspondent Imogen Foulkes has more.
The ILO study shows that 81% of the global workforce is now affected by the pandemic, with places of work either closed or on reduced hours. Worldwide, the ILO expects the crisis to wipe out almost 7% of working hours, the equivalent of 195 million full-time workers. The key sectors at risk include accommodation and food services, manufacturing and retail. No region of the world is immune. But while wealthier countries have offered some financial support for businesses and workers, in developing countries, millions of people are employed in the informal sector with no job protection. For them, the ILO says, the sudden loss of income will be devastating. The report urges governments to act fast, together, to avoid a global surge in unemployment and poverty.
Imogen Foulkes. Here in the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson remains in intensive care for a second night as he receives treatment for COVID-19. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is currently filling in for Mr Johnson, but at a news conference he was keen to stress that ministers are committed to following the Prime Minister's plan for dealing with the pandemic. He also spoke about Mr Johnson's condition.
He remains stable overnight. He's receiving standard oxygen treatment and breathing without any assistance. He's not required any mechanical ventilation or non-invasive respiratory support. He remains in good spirits, and in keeping with usual clinical practice, his progress continues to be monitored closely in critical care.
Our London correspondent Rob Watson was watching Mr Raab's news conference and had this assessment.
Mr. Raab was very much trying to steady the ship after the shock of yesterday, and in some sense he succeeded, saying, look, we're carrying on with the policies, but in the sense in the issue that who's in charge, I don't think he did succeed very well in that he was repeatedly asked, look, who is in charge? I think what emerged from the various exchanges with journalists is this, that nobody has taken over from Boris Johnson. I mean, Mr. Raab is not the new Prime Minister. I think it's fair to say that the government is in what you might call a sort of a holding pattern. They say they're following out the policies that Mr Johnson laid out before going to hospital. But as for, is there someone who could take the key decisions? I mean, at the moment, they have yet to work that out. They're hoping not, of course, to have to do it.
So what was your sense at this news conference? Is it steady as she goes? I mean, do you think they're on top of reaction to the pandemic?
I think that's certainly what they want you to think. And I think it's probably fair to say that the government is in control in terms of short-term strategy, which is basically the lockdown, which we see in all sorts of countries around the world, trying to hold tight until the peak of the pandemic is reached. I think what's not clear in dealing with your question is what comes next. What is the exit strategy? In other words, how do you get out of the lockdown? And who will ultimately decide that strategy if...
and said it would be good for the government to withdraw it. Last week, neighbouring Slovenia dropped similar phone tracking proposals following widespread opposition.
Guy Deloney. It's been a powerful theory that frontline medical staff who've died from COVID-19 experienced a more concentrated form of the disease because of their repeated close-up exposure to it. But how much truth is there in that? Dr. Michael Skinner is a virology expert at Imperial College London. He told the BBC's Paul Henley whether doctors are at a higher risk of developing more serious symptoms after being infected.
It's too early to say that. We wouldn't expect that in normal circumstances it will make a big difference from the kind of normal doses that the vast majority of us are liable to be exposed to. We suspect that the number of viruses that you actually need to infect you is going to be pretty small. We'd guess it was probably about 100 virus particles. 10 to maybe even 100-fold more of that. We'd be surprised if that would influence the course of the infection or its ultimate outcome.
Is it worse to be near one person who sneezes on you or relatively near 5 people? We talk about the high risk of exposing yourself to lots of people's version of the disease.
Probably won't make a huge amount of difference in